Well, it's great to be here with everybody today. I feel like I love these kind of events. They bring together the stormwater people and the zero waste people, who are like my two peoples. I chose this slide because I think today we're going to get wonky. Okay? And we're going to get wonky. All right. And we're going to be talking nuts and bolts and soup to nuts and all that stuff. So I chose this wonky slide. And we're going to talk about, my role here today is just to kind of do some more introduction. Miriam, this great matrix that she put together, I've put it in a slightly different format. And so I want to introduce some of the subjects, and then we're going to go into more detail in the different panel discussions. But we wanted to have an introduction to the framework that we're calling this, some of the basic ideas that we're going to go into detail. So the types of businesses, I got this kind of list here from Wikipedia. Obviously, there are a lot of different types of food businesses out there, and that's what makes some of these ordinances difficult and tricky and complicated, because you have to be flexible enough to deal with all the different types of food businesses that are out there, the different types of situations that can happen at a food business. But I tried to organize them a little bit, I think, for our purposes, in these kind of main three categories. And of course, there's a lot of overlap, and you know, you could organize it in different ways. But dining in, meaning that they're probably going to have a little bit more of an option for washable foodware. It's maybe more assumed that you're going to be sitting down and having some kind of a plate and then containers and beverage containers, food containers. How it's served to you is going to vary. You know, if it's a cafeteria, obviously that's different from the fine dining experience. But all of these should have more options for washable foodware. The takeout category in the middle is more challenging, and you're more likely to want to look at other options. But sometimes these businesses might, like so for the delivery, you think of you know, a pizza delivery company. They might be able to have a slice of pizza on site, but most of their business is probably going to be off site. The cafe is a great example for a hot cup kind of program, where you can maybe bring your own container or use theirs on site. And then there's the mobile category in the end, which probably is the least likely to use the washable foodware, but it is possible in some situations. And also I want to, well, so there's a couple health code kind of terminology references there: temporary food facilities, mobile food facilities. Those are two different categories, I think, that are common in the health code standards, and they have different regulations for them. And then caterers is also kind of a special category, because you want to consider in your ordinance if you're going to be affecting only what's served in your jurisdiction, or are you going to affect what's served outside of your jurisdiction? If the caterer is based in your jurisdiction, but they're taking the food somewhere else, are you going to regulate that as well, or are you going to just regulate what's served within the jurisdiction? So that's another kind of wrinkle. So I thought about these kind of 6 categories here for foodware policies. You know, like I said, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but the first 3 on the left are for dine-in, and the other 3 are for takeout, and then there's the different options, the 3 different options for each of those 2 categories. So for dine-in, you could use reusables, you could have disposables, and you could bring your own foodware. And so I think of those 3 situations. And then for takeout, you could bring your own foodware, and you could have disposables, and you could have reusables. And so those kind of 6 situations we're going to be talking about in more detail today. But to get into some of the key programs, this first one here, so I've kind of thought about 6 of the key programs that I thought of, and these are all, I think, in the matrix that you have there from Miriam in a different format. But and these are also, these 6 programs are kind of in the order that we're going to go through today with some of the panels. So I think the first 3 of these will be discussed in the first panel. So the first one is thinking about compostable and recyclable standards for disposables. Now, these are a lot of things that people have already done in this room and maybe even around the world. Some of these things are, you know, we unfortunately, I think, as Miriam and Unso have said, we've been focusing more on recycling and composting. We haven't focused as much on source reduction or reusables. And in fact, and just for refillables, it's starting to come back in the United States. Oregon, for some of you may know that Oregon has now started to bring back refillable bottles for beer bottles. So going back to where we used to be, hopefully we'll have more of that. I lived in Germany for a few years, and it's very common to have refillable bottles there. In fact, refillable plastic bottles are common there. And they're actually, the plastic in those refillable plastic bottles came from an American company, Eastman Chemical Company, that was part of Eastman Kodak, and separated out. So, you know, we've created some of these products in the United States, but we don't use them. They're used elsewhere, and it's kind of sad, I think. But maybe we'll start to do that again. So, compostable and recyclable standards, there's a lot of, I'm not going to go through all these. We're going to go through them in more detail later. But I did have a question. Are these presentations going to be made available to everybody later on a website? Or, yeah, so you don't have to write this down. You can read these in more detail later. But obviously there's a lot of different things you can do on the standards. One of the main ones is that you don't want, I don't think, the businesses to be deciding what's compostable or recyclable. You want your jurisdiction to decide that. And what's acceptable in your program, talking with your compost processors, what they can deal with, what they want to take. And that's something that's often been left out of the discussion in the past. We just said, oh, well, we'll take it all and somebody will figure it out later. Well, that's not the best way to do it. Oh, and for each of these, I've also got some exemptions to consider. And that gets into those kind of special situations where you want to have some flexibility. In this case, you know, maybe there's some recyclable materials like a metal that you might want to allow. Maybe those are more recyclable than some other materials. Okay, second one of my key programs here is the on-request disposables, and this is kind of I think the latest kind of trend. The state, you know, on request for straws. There are some jurisdictions that have already adopted this kind of an ordinance. We'll hear from them later today, like Oakland, on request for straws, and San Francisco, I think also. And this brings up some interesting items when it gets to straws, also for ADA reasons. And there's been a lot of discussion about, you know, people who need a straw just to be able to drink a beverage. And so we want to make sure we take those kind of situations into account as well and be flexible with that. One thing that I think that is interesting about the whole straw issue and you know, differently abled people is that was never required in the past that a restaurant or some kind of food business have a straw for those people. Do we want to require that now, that they provide a straw that works for those people? That's an interesting discussion that people will have. And I think some people in the ADA community would say, yes, if I want to go to a restaurant and I want to be able to drink a beverage and the only way that I can drink a beverage is through a straw, they should have to provide that. Other people think, well, wait a minute, we've never required that in the past. Why do we need to require that now, especially when we're trying to require other types of straws or drinking tools? Okay, a third program is bans. And I, for one, kind of feel like I wish we hadn't had the plastic bag ban in California. I wish that we had had a charge. Instead, it had both plastic and paper bags as an option and gone with, like, Ireland, when they had their 25-cent charge, or when I was in Germany, a lot of the charges that were on the plastic bags. That seemed to me a better way to go, because there are some situations where maybe a plastic bag is actually better than a paper bag. And the environmental difference between the two is not always so clear. But we were preempted from that in California. We weren't allowed to do the charge on the plastic bags, and we had to switch to the ban strategy, and it has worked well. But for some things, you maybe don't want to ban them. Maybe a charge is better. And but there are certain, I think, problematic materials like styrofoam. Maybe it's better just not to have it at all. And so these are the kind of things you need to think about. One problem with bans is that then you sometimes have to go through a CEQA process for that. I don't think that's the case with charges, because it's not a tax, and you're not putting a preference on one product over another. You're saying you should pay a price to use a certain product. Reusables for dine-in is obviously a good new category of things to discuss, and that's a lot of these elements that are in here are also in the draft ordinance that's being considered in Berkeley right now. So I've been working on that with a few other people here, Miriam and Martin and Jack and I have been, and Samantha, we've all been working on that draft ordinance in Berkeley for a couple of years now, and it's actually going to the council next week in Berkeley. So we'll, for the first reading. So we'll see what happens. So that's another kind of framework for these different programs that we have here. A lot of these things are being considered in the Berkeley ordinance, and of course Berkeley. I think I was on the Zero Waste Commission in Berkeley for about a decade, and we didn't achieve a lot, I can say, unfortunately. But I think Berkeley now has a new council, new mayor, new kind of feeling of wanting to be a leader again, like they were maybe back in the 80s when they passed, I think it was the first styrofoam ban in California, if not in the country. And then they kind of let things slide for a while. And so now I think they want to take a leadership role again. And we're in some ways following the leadership role of some of the other communities in the Bay Area. But on this particular thing, they might be the first to have a charge on probably a beverage container citywide. That might be the first in the world that we know of for a municipal ordinance. So that's exciting. And one of the key elements also is to try to make reusables required for dine-in customers. And that is challenging when you have certain businesses and their model is to only use disposable foodware. They don't have washing facilities on site. They may not be able to fit in washing facilities on site. And what about new businesses? Can you require new businesses, at least, maybe those you can try to do more, but the existing businesses, how do you deal with those? So there's obviously going to be some waivers or contemplation of waivers for some existing businesses. It's going to be challenging. And then, as I mentioned, charges, and it's not a fee, it's not a tax, it's a charge, and that's a big distinction legally. And there are certain things you need to take into consideration when it's a charge. And we think that's going to be a very successful way to incentivize people to either bring their own or to use other types of foodware and not the disposables. And one of the things that is interesting also when you start to get into the details is it considered taxable sales or not, that charge, that 25 cents? And so we have some language that Stop Waste helped us work on, and San Mateo County's also been working on this from some guidance from the state franchise tax board on what language you can add to your ordinance to allow the businesses to include that as a non-taxable sale amount. So, and that the business is keeping that charge, it's not going to a government agency. That's one of the things that differentiates it from a tax or a fee. So, we might be able to talk about that more later. Reusables for takeout is an interesting category because there are all these different types of takeout businesses, as well as businesses that only do the delivery part of it. There are more and more of those, like DoorDash, and I think there's Caviar, there's Uber Eats. There's all these businesses that's all they do is just the delivery part of it. How are they going to deal with this issue of reusable foodware, or even the charge? If there's no option, for a customer having something delivered to their home, if there's no way that they could use their own foodware or use a reusable program, do you still want to have the charge on that? So that's an interesting discussion. I was at a Warriors game the other night, you cannot bring your own foodware very easily into a Warriors game. And so how do you do that? How do you bring your own foodware when there's a security issue? Right? Maybe you can bring in a paper cup, but you can't bring too much else into a Warriors game. And now they could certainly use reusable foodware, and you can have like souvenir cups. A lot of events have those now where you can pay a little extra, and maybe you keep it or maybe you return it. It could be a deposit program. So there's different things you can do at events. But security is an additional constraint sometimes. And as I mentioned before, you want to consider the geographical limits of a program, either within the jurisdiction, outside of the jurisdiction for caterers, but also you might do a pilot program in part of your jurisdiction to start it with. There's certainly some advantages of a citywide program, but it's something, it may be a lot of work to go, day one, citywide.